The boardroom had been silent for 3 full seconds before anyone realized that the CEO was about to lose her composure. $50 million sat on that conference table not in cash, but in a set of structural blueprints that every senior engineer and department head had already approved. The woman at the head of the table, known throughout the industry for her unshakable control, was staring at a screen with an expression that no one in the room had ever seen before. And standing near the door, still holding a toolbox, was the last person anyone expected to be at the center of a $50 million crisis. What would you do if the most overlooked person in the room turned out to be the only one who could see the truth? Stay until the end to find out. Connor Hale was 28 years old, and to anyone passing him in the hallway, he looked exactly like what his badge said he was: maintenance staff. He wore gray work pants and a plain navy shirt, walked with the kind of quiet efficiency that made him practically invisible in a building full of people who believed that presence required volume. He was tall and lean, not in the polished way of someone who spent money on appearances, but in the way of a man who simply did not waste energy on anything unnecessary. He kept his tools organized, arrived on time, and did his job without needing anyone's approval to feel good about it. But Connor Hale had not always been a maintenance worker. 6 years earlier, he had been a structural design engineer at one of the most respected civil infrastructure firms on the East Coast. He had been considered unusually talented, the kind of engineer who thought in systems rather than components, who could look at a load-bearing calculation and immediately feel the places where the math was lying. His colleagues called it instinct. His professors had called it rare. He had called it paying attention. Then his wife, Rachel, was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. Then she died. Then he had a 5-year-old son named Carter, and a grief so heavy he could barely get through a single workday without his hands shaking. He left the firm. He took a quieter job. He was still putting Carter to bed every night, still making lunches every morning, still doing the math that mattered most to him, which was not load coefficients, but whether his son felt safe. Carter Hale was 6 years old and already startlingly perceptive. He noticed things adults missed. The way his father went quiet before a storm. The way certain songs made Connor set down his coffee and stare at nothing. Carter didn't ask many questions. He just stayed close. And that closeness was worth more to Connor than any title, any salary, any return to the career he had stepped away from. Abigail Stone was 27 years old and ran a construction technology company with the precision and intensity of someone who had never once been told to slow down and get it wrong. She had taken over the firm 2 years earlier, at 25, after the previous CEO, a man her father's age, who had underestimated her, exactly once stepped down. Under her leadership, revenue had nearly doubled. Her instincts for risk were sharp, her tolerance for error was essentially zero, and her ability to read a room and cut through noise had made her, in some circles, genuinely feared. She was not, by nature, cruel, but she was demanding in the way that people become demanding when they have been disappointed too many times by people who were supposed to know better. She expected competence. She expected accountability. And she expected the people around her to understand that when $50 million was on the line, there was no room for sentiment. Sebastian Kvitar was 45, the company's director of engineering, and the man most directly responsible for the bridge system design that was about to change everything. He was confident in the way that experienced professionals sometimes become, not because the work didn't warrant scrutiny, but because he had stopped expecting to be surprised. Evelyn Grant was 32, the CEO's executive assistant, and the only person in the building who had learned to tell the difference between Abigail Stone making a decision and Abigail Stone making a mistake. She had been watching people for a long time. It was the most valuable skill she possessed. None of them knew, on the morning this story begins, that a maintenance call for a broken projector would alter the trajectory of a $50 million project, the careers of 3 people, and the safety of everyone who would one day walk across a bridge that almost became a catastrophe. The project had a name, officially, the Meridian Smart Bridge Initiative. Internally, everyone called it the $50 million bet, though no one said it out loud in front of Abigail. It was the most ambitious project the company had ever undertaken, a series of interconnected smart bridge structures that would incorporate real-time load monitoring, adaptive support systems, and environmental stress feedback loops. If it worked the way the engineering team promised, it would set a new standard for infrastructure design in the country. If it didn't, the consequences would go far beyond financial. The final design review had been scheduled for 9 in the morning. By 8:55, the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor was full. Sebastian Cole stood near the projection screen with the particular posture of a man who had already rehearsed his talking points and found them satisfying. 6 engineers flanked him, their presentation materials organized into a sequence that was designed to communicate one thing above all: we have thought of everything. Abigail Stone arrived at exactly 9. She sat at the head of the table, set her notepad down, and looked at the screen. She did not smile. She did not offer any opening remarks. She said, simply, "Begin." The presentation started well. The conceptual framework was solid. The material specifications were current. The timeline was aggressive but defensible. Sebastian moved through each section with the calm authority of a man in his element, and the room began to fill with the particular energy of people who believed they were looking at something that was going to work. Then the projector died. It was not a dramatic failure. The image simply winked out, replaced by a blue error screen that no one at the table knew how to fix. A junior associate tried restarting the laptop. The screen stayed blue. Someone called down to facilities. 3 minutes later, Connor Hale came through the door with a toolbox and a quiet apology for the interruption. He moved to the equipment cart near the wall and began working on the connection panel at the back of the projector unit. Nobody paid attention to him. That was, in a sense, the point. A maintenance worker in a boardroom is furniture. People look through them the way they look through a window. The glass is there, but what matters is what's outside. Except Connor wasn't looking outside. He was looking at the screen. The projector had flickered back on during the reboot sequence, and the presentation had advanced to a structural schematic, a detailed cross-section of the bridge's primary load-bearing joints. Connor's hands stilled on the cable he was reconnecting. His eyes moved across the diagram with the speed of someone who had spent years doing exactly this kind of analysis. The geometry was familiar, the system architecture was familiar. The load distribution model was one he recognized from deep in his own memory, from years before, from a project he had worked on at a previous firm and had never seen anyone else develop independently. But there was a number in the upper right corner of the schematic that was wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way, not the kind of wrong that a person catches in a quick glance. It was the kind of wrong that sits quietly inside a calculation for months, building pressure, the way a hairline fracture builds pressure invisibly, inevitably, until the moment it cannot be contained. The safety coefficient for dynamic load tolerance had been calculated using a standard temperature baseline, but this bridge system, as designed, would be deployed across a region with significant seasonal temperature variation. Under those conditions, the material stress response changed. The coefficient should have been adjusted. It had not been. The number on the screen represented a calculation that was technically within accepted ranges, but practically insufficient for the real-world conditions the structure would face. Connor set down his cable. He stood very still for a moment, looking at the number. He understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent years thinking about exactly these kinds of failure modes, that a bridge built according to these specifications would not fail immediately. It would stand. It would open. People would drive across it and walk across it, and trust it the way people trust structures that look solid and have been approved by experts. And then, somewhere between 6 and 8 months after full load-bearing use began, the stress accumulation at the primary joints would reach a threshold that the design had not accounted for. He looked at the people at the table. They were not looking at him. He thought about what it meant to say something. He was a maintenance worker. His clearance did not extend to design files. His badge did not open the doors where this kind of decision was made. If he raised his hand and said, "There is a problem with your load coefficient," he would be told to fix the projector and leave. He knew this, the way he knew most things about the world he currently occupied, not with bitterness, but with accuracy. He thought about Carter, about the way his son had once asked him, after watching a documentary about a bridge collapse overseas, whether bridges in their city were safe, about the way Connor had said yes and meant it, because he had spent years making it true for other people. He pulled a work tablet from his bag. He accessed the shared building network. a standard maintenance access point that all facility staff used to log equipment reports and pull technical schematics for systems they serviced. The bridge design file was stored in the company's project server. Connor was not supposed to be in that folder. He had no technical authorization to edit anything inside it. He opened it anyway. The edit took 4 minutes. He changed a single value, the dynamic load safety coefficient, and added a comment tag with a flag notation that would appear the next time anyone with admin access opened the file. He did not sign it. He did not explain it. He closed the file, finished reconnecting the projector cable, packed his bag, and left the room. He took the stairs back down to the maintenance level and spent the rest of his morning replacing a faulty HVAC filter on the 8th floor. He did not tell anyone what he had done. He was not sure it would ever matter, but it had been necessary, and so he had done it. What Connor did not know, could not have known, was that Abigail Stone would look at that file again before the day was over, and that the flag notation he had left would be the first thing she saw. The afternoon presentation resumed after the projector issue was resolved, and the full engineering team presented their final sequence without incident. Abigail listened. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them answered adequately. At 2:15, she dismissed the room and told Evelyn to hold her calls until 4. She sat alone with the design files for 40 minutes. It was not unusual for her to do this. She had taught herself, over years of leading people who were technically more experienced than she was, to go back to source documents after meetings and read them without the interpretive layer that a room full of confident voices creates. She had caught 3 significant errors this way in the past 2 years. She had never mentioned this to anyone. She did not need credit for being careful. The flag notation appeared when she opened the primary structural schematic. It was not a detailed explanation. It was simply a red marker with 2 words. Check coefficient. Abigail did not know what to make of it. She looked at the metadata. The file had been accessed at 9:17 that morning, exactly the window during which the projector had been down and the presentation had been paused. The system log showed the access point, a maintenance tablet. Badge number assigned to facility staff. She pulled the badge registry. Connor Hale. Maintenance technician, level 2. No engineering credentials on file. She looked at the schematic. She looked at the coefficient he had changed. She pulled up the original version of the file from the backup server and compared them side by side. The change was minimal, a single numerical value, shifted from 2.1 to 2.47. Small enough that no one in a presentation setting would notice. Significant enough, she began to realize, as she read the accompanying flag, to matter under certain conditions. She did not say anything to herself out loud, but she felt the thing she always felt when information arrived in a form she hadn't anticipated, the cold, focused attention of someone who cannot afford to be wrong. She called Evelyn, find out who Connor Hale is, and bring him to the 14th floor conference room. Now, Evelyn, to her credit, did not ask why. She called the maintenance department, relayed the request, and then, because she had been watching Abigail Stone for 3 years and had developed certain instincts, she also quietly texted Sebastian Cole. By 3:45, the same conference room that had held a polished technical presentation 8 hours earlier had reassembled around a very different purpose. Sebastian was there, along with 2 of his lead engineers. Evelyn stood near the door. Abigail was at the head of the table. Connor came in wearing the same gray work pants he had worn that morning. He was still carrying his badge on its clip. He looked at the room with the expression of a man who understood, immediately, what he was walking into. He did not look away from it. He set his hands at his sides and waited. Abigail did not waste time. You accessed a restricted project file this morning. You modified a design parameter in a $50 million infrastructure project without authorization, without credentials, and without notifying anyone. Is that correct? Connor said. Yes. Why? There was a beat, not a hesitation, but the pause of a man who chooses his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Because the coefficient was wrong, he said. If you build from that file, the primary load joints will fail. Not immediately. Somewhere, between 6 and 8 months, after the bridge reaches full operational load. It depends on the season. Winter would accelerate it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of intelligent people hears something that their instincts are already processing before their logic has caught up. Sebastian Cole was the first to speak. His voice had the particular edge of a man whose authority has been questioned in front of people who respect him. "That's an extraordinary claim from a maintenance technician," he said. "We have a team of 6 licensed structural engineers who spent 4 months on this design. You looked at it for what, 15 minutes? While fixing a cable. And you think you've identified a flaw they all missed?" Connor looked at him. "I don't think I identified it. I identified it. Whether you believe that is a separate question." Sebastian's expression shifted in the way that expressions shift when a person recognizes that the most effective response is contempt. "This is a waste of everyone's time. He clearly doesn't understand the methodology we used. The safety coefficients in that design are within code." "Within standard code," Connor said. "Not within the operational range for the deployment region. The temperature variance between January and July in that corridor creates a material stress response that your baseline calculation doesn't account for. The joints will hold under static load. They won't hold under the combination of dynamic stress and thermal cycling over a sustained period." Sebastian leaned back. "And you know this because you fix HVAC units." The room was entirely still. Connor did not raise his voice. He did not shift his posture. He simply said the sentence that would stay with everyone in that room for years afterward. "I know this because if that bridge fails, people die, and I know what the math looks like when it's wrong." Abigail, who had not moved since the meeting began, was watching Connor with the kind of attention she usually reserved for problems she had not yet solved. She had come into this room prepared to be angry. She was still angry, in the way that people remain angry when they are also afraid not of the person in front of them, but of what it means if the person in front of them is right. She said, "You're not authorized to access or modify company design files. You understand that what you did carries serious consequences." "Yes," Connor said. "Then why didn't you find another way? Report it through proper channels? Submit a maintenance concern form?" He looked at her steadily. "Because no one on that floor knew I existed, and because the review was scheduled for sign-off by end of day, there wasn't time for proper channels." The honesty of it was almost uncomfortable. Not because it was an excuse, it clearly wasn't presented as one, but because it was accurate, and everyone in the room knew it. Abigail held his gaze. Then she said, to the room, "Someone pull the original coefficient calculation, now, and get me the thermal variance data for the Meridian deployment corridor." The silence that settled over the room while Evelyn pulled the documents from the server was the kind that happens when intelligent people begin to suspect that they are about to be embarrassed and cannot yet calculate the magnitude. Sebastian watched the screen over one of his engineer's shoulders, with the expression of a man who is simultaneously hoping to be vindicated and beginning to understand that hope may not be enough. Connor stood where he had been standing since he came in. He had not been offered a seat. He did not ask for one. Abigail said, "You have 2 minutes. Walk me through it." Connor moved to the screen. He pulled up the structural schematic that the team had last seen in that morning's presentation. He didn't use a pointer. He simply stood beside the image and spoke the way people speak when they have known something for a long time and do not need to perform certainty because they simply have it. "The bridge system uses a continuous composite beam design across the primary span," he said. "The load model is correct for static conditions. The issue is here." He indicated the load joint notation in the upper section. The dynamic load safety factor was calculated at 2.1. That number is drawn from a standard reference model that assumes a temperature range of 40 degrees Fahrenheit across a 12-month cycle. The deployment corridor for this project experiences a range of approximately 73 degrees. That difference matters because the composite material has a stress response curve that is not linear across that range. He paused for exactly the amount of time needed to make sure the room was tracking. Below freezing, the material contracts and stiffens. That stiffness increases brittleness at the joint interface. Under sustained dynamic load, which is exactly what you get from traffic, weight, and vibration, the fatigue accumulation rate at those joints increases by approximately 31% over what the model predicts. At the original coefficient of 2.1, you have a margin. But the margin is consumed by that 31% difference. After 6 to 8 months of full operational load in seasonal cycling, the margin is gone. The joint fails. One of Sebastian's engineers, a young woman named Dana, who had not spoken once during the morning presentation, had opened a calculation program on her laptop and was running numbers quietly while Connor spoke. No one told her to stop. Sebastian said, "The material spec we used has been validated in environments with similar temperature ranges. Different beam lengths," Connor said, "and different traffic volume projections. The meridian spans are 43% longer than the reference structures in that validation study. Stress accumulation scales non-linearly with span length. The validation data doesn't transfer directly." The room had stopped sounding like a disciplinary meeting. It sounded now like something else, like an engineering review, except conducted by a man whose last formal engineering role no one in that room yet knew about. Evelyn, who was standing near the back wall, watched Abigail's face with the careful attention of someone reading a document in a language they have studied but not mastered. She saw the moment brief, almost imperceptible, when something behind Abigail's eyes shifted from hostility to calculation. Dana looked up from her laptop. Her voice was quiet. "The thermal variance correction, if I apply the adjusted coefficient to the current span length and the projected traffic load, the failure threshold." She looked at Sebastian. "He's right about the margin. With the original number, we would be operating within 4% of the failure threshold under peak conditions. That's not a safe margin for this kind of structure." Sebastian stood very still. Connor did not acknowledge Dana's statement. He did not look at Sebastian. He looked at Abigail. "I changed the coefficient to 2.47, he said. "That restores the margin to a level appropriate for the operational conditions. It will require recalculating the joint reinforcement specifications about 3 to 4 days of work for a competent team. The rest of the design is sound." Abigail said nothing for a long moment. The room waited for her, the way rooms always waited for her, with the particular mixture of attention and tension that a leader earns when the people around them have learned that her silences end in decisions. Dana was still looking at her laptop. She said, almost to herself, "The base model for this system, the adaptive load monitoring architecture, I've seen something like this before, not widely published. There was a white paper from a firm called Whitmore Structural, published about 7 years ago. The author's name was..." She stopped. She looked up. She looked at Connor. Connor said nothing. Dana pulled the paper up on her screen. She read the author line. She turned the laptop so that its screen faced the room. The paper was titled, "Dynamic Load Tolerance in Variable Temperature Composite Bridge Systems." The author was listed as Connor R. Hale, Senior Design Engineer, Whitmore Structural Analytics. The room did not make a sound. Abigail read the screen. She read it again. Then she looked at Connor Hale, the maintenance worker, the man with the toolbox and the gray work pants and the badge that said Level 2 Facilities, and said the only thing that seemed appropriate, "Who are you?" He did not answer immediately. Not because he was composing a story, but because the question deserved accuracy, and accuracy about who he was took a moment to organize into words that fit inside a conference room. "I was a structural design engineer," he said. "Senior level, at Whitmore, for about 4 years. Before that, graduate research in composite materials and dynamic load systems at Georgia Tech." He paused. "I left the field 6 years ago." Abigail said, "Why?" "Personal reasons." She looked at him with the expression of someone who finds that answer incomplete but has enough information to reconstruct the shape of it. She didn't push. It was possibly the first time in the meeting she had chosen not to. Sebastian had not spoken since Dana set the laptop on the table. He was looking at the white paper with the expression of a man processing several things at once: the technical data, its implications, and the significantly more uncomfortable implication beneath that, which was the question of where his team's design model had actually come from. Because the architecture of the Meridian system, the adaptive load monitoring framework, the composite beam configuration, the feedback loop design was not standard. It was distinctive. It reflected a set of engineering choices that had a specific intellectual origin. And the man who had developed the intellectual origin of those choices was standing in the room, wearing gray work pants. Dana was the one who said it. She said it quietly, without accusation, because she was an engineer and she was more interested in accuracy than in comfort. "Sebastian," she said, "the base model for the Meridian system. Where did it originate?" Sebastian said, "I pulled from existing research literature." "This white paper was in the reference library," Dana said. "I can see it in the file's source documentation. The framework, the adaptive tolerance algorithm, it's adapted from this. From Hale's work." She looked at her screen, but the adaptation changed the thermal compensation variable. That's where the error came from. Someone modified the original model without accounting for the full parameter range that the original methodology required. The accuracy of this was not contested. It couldn't be. The documentation was right there. Connor looked at none of them in particular. He looked at a point somewhere in the middle distance, the way a person looks when they have known something for a long time and have not yet decided how to feel about learning it out loud. He had recognized the architecture in the morning presentation. He had known when he saw it on the screen that it was derived from his work. He had not said anything about that. Not when he corrected the file, not when he was brought upstairs, not during his entire explanation of the error. He had not said, "This is my design. You used my work. You changed it incorrectly." He had said, "The coefficient is wrong, and here is why." Abigail Stone stood up. It was the first time she had moved from her chair since the meeting began. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the room for a moment. Not long, perhaps 8 seconds, and then she turned around. Her expression had changed. The cold precision was still there, but underneath it, there was something else. The contained, uncomfortable energy of a person who has been holding a position that is no longer defensible and has just acknowledged that fact to themselves. She looked at Sebastian. "You built a $50 million project on modified research without verifying the modification against the original methodology," Sebastian said. "The research was adapted by the team. You were responsible for the team," Abigail said. Her voice was level. It was, in its way, worse than anger. "You were responsible for the methodology. You signed off on those specifications. If this project had moved to construction..." She stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She looked at Connor. "You found the error. You corrected it. You said nothing about the fact that the underlying design came from your work." "It wasn't relevant to the correction," Connor said. "It is extremely relevant," Abigail said. "The bridge needed to be fixed. Who developed the original model doesn't change the math." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, "it doesn't, but it changes everything else." What happened in the next 20 minutes was the kind of thing that people who were present would describe differently, depending on how they felt about authority and accountability and the specific difficulty of watching a powerful person do something genuinely hard. Abigail Stone turned to Sebastian Cole, and without raising her voice, told him that his employment with the company was terminated effective immediately. She told him to leave his access cards with Evelyn on his way out. She told him that the project was suspended pending full re-evaluation of the source methodology and the corrected specifications. She said all of this in 3 sentences. Sebastian left the room. He did not argue. There was, by that point, nothing to argue. The 2 remaining engineers looked at their laptops, at the wall, at their hands. Evelyn closed her notepad. Abigail looked at Connor. She said, "I want to offer you the position of lead structural engineer on the Meridian project. Full credentials review, contract to be drafted within 72 hours, compensation at senior level. You would have full authority over the redesigned specifications and direct report access to me." The room was very quiet. Connor did not answer immediately. He looked down for a moment, not at the floor exactly, but inward, the way people look when they are consulting something that cannot be read from the outside. Evelyn, who was watching him, thought she understood what he was consulting. She had seen parents do it before. That specific quality of pause. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I have a son. He's 6. My schedule right now is built around him. School pickups, evenings, the routine he depends on. I left my career once because my family needed me. I'm not in a position to step back into a senior role that requires the kind of hours that role normally requires." Abigail did not say anything for a moment. She was processing something, not the logistics of the offer, but the architecture of the person in front of her. She had spent 2 years making decisions in rooms like this one. She had hired people and fired people and restructured teams and redirected projects and negotiated contracts. She was very good at all of it. But she was standing in front of a man who had, in a single day, prevented a structural catastrophe, demonstrated expertise that exceeded every credentialed engineer in her building, declined to use that expertise for personal leverage, and turned down a senior position because it would affect his son's routine. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she had been looking at the world through a lens that had a blind spot she had never examined. "What would you need?" she said. "Not what the role requires. What would you need in order to take it?" Connor looked at her. This was, he recognized, a different kind of question from the ones she had been asking. It was not a challenge. It was not strategy. It was a genuine inquiry, offered by someone who had decided that the answer mattered more than the terms she had prepared in advance. He said, "Flexible hours. I need to be available at 7:30 and 3:15 every day without exception. I need work-from-home capability for at least 3 days a week. I need a team that communicates in writing, so I have a record and can catch problems in documentation, not just in meetings. And I need the authority to stop any phase of this project if I identify a safety issue, without going through 3 levels of approval first." Evelyn wrote all of it down. Abigail nodded. She said, "Those are reasonable conditions." Connor said nothing. Abigail Stone then did something that none of the people in the room, including Evelyn, who had known her for 3 years, had ever seen her do. She said, "Clearly, without qualification or softening, I owe you an apology. The way this meeting began, the way I spoke to you, was wrong. Not procedurally wrong, personally wrong. You came into a room where no one knew who you were, told us the truth about something that could have hurt people, and I responded by treating you like a threat. I'm sorry." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was simply full, the way silence is full when something true has been said and nothing needs to be added. Connor said, "I'll take the position." The Meridian Smart Bridge Initiative was formally placed on hold the following morning. An official notice went to the contracting partners citing a scheduled methodology review, standard language, nothing that suggested the near disaster that had been quietly avoided. Within 72 hours, Connor Hale had signed a contract, collected his new badge a different clearance level this time, and sat down with Dana and the remaining engineering team to begin rebuilding the design specifications from the ground up. He brought the original white paper with him, not as a statement, not as evidence of anything, simply as the most complete version of the methodology. He walked the team through it the way a teacher walks students through a proof, not by telling them the answer, but by showing them the reasoning so they could follow it and eventually extend it themselves. Dana proved to be genuinely excellent. She had understood the thermal variance issue before Connor had finished explaining it in the conference room, which told him something important about where the design error had originated. It had not come from the engineers doing the day-to-day work. It had come from the direction they had been given and the oversight that had been absent above them. Connor worked 3 days a week in the office, as he had negotiated. On the other days, he worked from the kitchen table in the apartment where he and Carter lived, the same apartment where he had spent 6 years rebuilding a life that looked nothing like the one he had planned and had turned out to matter far more. Carter, who now knew that his father had a new job involving bridges and something about the number 2.47, took to drawing bridges in his sketchbook and leaving them on the counter by the coffee maker. The revised specifications were completed in 11 days. The corrected design passed an independent structural review with 2 engineering consultants brought in from outside the company. Both consultants noted the thermal variance adjustment and called it, in their report, a technically rigorous and necessary correction that demonstrates thorough operational foresight. Connor read their report. He set it down. He went to pick Carter up from school. Abigail Stone, for her part, did not publicize any of this. She absorbed the experience privately, reorganized several of the company's engineering oversight processes, and implemented a documentation review protocol that required all methodology adaptations to be traced back to their source research before any project could move to the final sign-off stage. She also, quietly, found out what Connor Hale's salary had been at his last engineering position. She offered him a contract at 22% above that rate. When he signed it, she did not make a speech. She simply said, "Thank you for not letting it fail." He said, "That's the job." The Meridian bridges, when they were eventually constructed 14 months later, on a revised timeline that accounted for the redesign, became one of the most cited examples of smart bridge engineering in the country. The adaptive load monitoring system worked exactly as the original methodology had predicted. In the first winter after construction, the thermal stress sensors flagged a pressure pattern at one of the secondary joints that the system automatically adjusted for, precisely as designed. Nobody who drove across those bridges knew any of this. They knew only that the structure held their weight and brought them safely to the other side, which was, in the end, the only thing that had ever been required of it. Connor Hale drove across one of those bridges on a Saturday morning in November, with Carter in the back seat. Carter, who had been given a very simplified version of what his father's new job involved, pressed his face to the car window as they crossed and said, "Is this one of your bridges, Dad?" Connor looked at the suspension cables against the gray November sky. He thought about a conference room, a projector, a number that had been quietly wrong. He thought about what it had cost to say something and what it would have cost not to. "Yeah," he said. "This one's mine." The story of Connor Hale and the Meridian Project is not, at its core, a story about engineering. It is a story about the gap between how we see people and who they actually are and the price we pay, sometimes literally, and sometimes in ways we never get to calculate, when that gap goes uncorrected. Every organization has a version of Connor, a person whose formal position does not reflect their actual knowledge, someone who has stepped back from a career for reasons that have nothing to do with capability and everything to do with the demands of a life that required their full attention. These people move through hallways and conference rooms and work floors with titles that tell you nothing useful about them, and the question is not whether they exist, they always do, but whether the structures around them are designed to hear them or to look past them. The error in the Meridian design was not a failure of intelligence. The engineers on that team were competent. The data they worked from was real. The mistake was a failure of verification, specifically, the failure to trace a methodology back to its origin and confirm that the adaptation they had made preserved the conditions under which the original was valid. That is a process failure. It is also a cultural failure because the culture of the organization had produced a structure in which a senior director's confidence was treated as equivalent to rigor. Connor did not speak up through official channels. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, not to excuse it, but to understand it. He had calculated, accurately, that official channels would not produce a response in time. He had made a judgment call about what was necessary, knowing there would be consequences, and acted on it anyway. That is not the behavior of someone who does not understand authority. It is the behavior of someone who understands it well enough to know when it is insufficient. The silence of the competent is often mistaken for the absence of opinion. People who are very good at their work frequently do not announce themselves. They do not campaign for recognition. They do not insert themselves into conversations to demonstrate what they know. They wait until the moment when what they know is actually needed, and then they say it once, clearly, without ornamentation. And because that is not how most institutions are designed to receive information, the message frequently arrives at the wrong address and gets filed under the wrong category. The lesson, if there is one that can be carried out of a boardroom and into the everyday life of any organization, is this: the person who fixes your projector may understand your problem better than everyone in the room who holds a title. The question is whether you have built a room, a culture, a set of habits, a way of paying attention that makes it possible to hear them before the cost of not hearing them becomes real. Connor Hale never stopped being a father first. He never stopped believing that the work mattered for its own reasons, independent of the recognition it received. And on a gray November morning, driving across a bridge that had almost been a disaster and had instead become something safe and lasting, he told his 6-year-old son the truth. This one was his, and it had held.